All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Commercial Aviation Coordinating Commission meeting. In order to conserve bandwidth, we are asking all commission members to keep their microphone and video on mute the entire meeting unless you are speaking during question and comment periods. If you have a comment during a presentation, please use the hand raising tool. We ask that all members of the public keep their video and microphone turned off for the whole meeting, except when called on during the public comment period that will start shortly. If you would like to speak during the public comment period, please use the comment box now, write your comment followed by your first and last name, and I will call on you to speak when it is your turn. You will have 2 minutes to speak when I call your name. Thank you all for your cooperation. Now I'll turn the meeting over to Cacc Chair David Fleckenstein.
Thanks, Christina. As we get started, I am going to take a roll call. So if you would just please identify yourself as I call your name. Jeffrey Brown. Jeffrey Brown.
This is Claire. I know Jeffrey will be joining, so David, if you'll just loop back around, I'm sure he'll be on momentarily. We were in another meeting at the port.
All right, thank you. Lauren Carr.
I am here.
Thank you. Steve Edmondson.
Here.
Tom Embleton.
I'm here.
Thanks, Tom. Mark Inglesian. Here. Thanks, Mark. Eric Gauss.
Present.
Thanks, Eric. Andrea Goodpasture. I believe Andrea is not able to join us. Shane Jones.
Present.
Thanks, Shane. Larry Crowder.
Present.
Thanks, Larry. Stroud Kunkel.
Here.
Thanks, Stroud. Jim Kuntz.
Here.
Thanks, Jim. Robin Toth. Robin Toth. Okay, we'll have to come back to Robin later in the meeting. Bryce Yaden.
I'm here, thank you.
Thanks, Bryce. Tony Bean.
Present.
Thanks, Tony. Lois Bollenbach. And I believe Lois was unable to join us as well. Representative Dent.
I'm here. Representative Dent's here.
Thanks, sir. Warren Hendrickson.
Present.
Thanks, Warren. Robert Hodgman. Thanks, Rob. Senator Honeyford. I know Senator Honeyford was on earlier. He had to reboot his computer, so I think he's still in the process of doing that. Senator Kaiser.
Here.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Orwell.
Here.
Thank you. Robert Rodriguez.
Present.
Thanks, Robert. Rudy Rudolph.
Present.
Thanks, Rudy. Jason Thibodeau. Jason Thibodeau, are you still with us?
I'm here. Apologies, I couldn't find that mic button.
That's okay. Thanks, Jason. And Carrie Wooler.
Here.
Thanks, Carrie. Okay, so for the agenda today, again, welcome everyone to this morning's CAC meeting. Today's agenda includes another opportunity for public comment, followed by a roll-up from Christina Cray and Lindsay Burgess on the feedback we received from the online open house and the 2 virtual public meetings. The Kimley Horn consultant team working on the aviation system plan, which is helping inform our commission, will recap the greenfield analysis and then speak briefly about the potential outcomes from not meeting demand. I want to point out ahead of time that this is not trying to persuade commission members that we have to find a solution that meets all the demand. However, it is important that we acknowledge the potential outcomes of not meeting demand. Rob Hodgman is then going to run us through the recommendation for narrowing the greenfield options. Once Rob is finished, I'll open it up for questions and then we'll take a 10-minute break. Following the break, I'll talk about what the planning team sees as the various options for us to consider moving forward. From these options, Warren and I, with the planning group, will provide our recommendation. We will discuss it, and Warren will hopefully lead us into a vote A vote could be to approve the recommendation or something else. The goal really is to have something concrete that allows us to meet the 15 October deadline of narrowing down the existing airports and or greenfield site. Finally, before adjourning, we will talk about the next steps. And with that, if there are any questions about the agenda, I'm going to hand it over to Christina and we'll start the public comment period.
Thank you, David.
Chris-
We continue to receive public comments sent to the Cacc email. All comments are compiled and sent to all Cacc members on a recurring basis for their review. We will now start the public comment period for this meeting. Working from the chat box submissions you provided, I will state your name and you'll have 2 minutes for public comment. If at the end of 2 minutes you go over, I will state your 2 minutes are over and ask that you please wrap up your comment. Please abide by the protocols of the commission meeting to help this meeting run smoothly. And again, thank you for your cooperation. After the comment period ends, members of the public may still make comments in the comment box, but we will not address them during the course of the meeting. Now we will start with Nora Kammer.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Nora Kammer with Skagit River System Cooperative. I represent the environmental interests of Soxhawtl Tribe located in Darrington and the Swinomish Tribe in Lackawanna. SRSC works on behalf of these two tribes to actively improve fisheries in the Skagit and Samish basins, areas that were ceded to the U.S. through treaties in 1855. These tribes are guardians of the Skagit and Samish basins and surrounding coastal areas, and we've worked as co-managers of Washington fisheries for many years, protecting ESA-threatened listings of Skagit Chinook populations and other salmon. The Skagit River is home to winter and summer steelhead populations and all 5 species of salmon. The Skagit River is the largest freshwater river draining to Puget Sound. Protection of the Skagit populations and the habitats that sustain it are essential to recovery of salmon in Puget Sound region-wide. We learned about this proposal in the newspaper. The state failed to do any outreach to tribal governments regarding these proposals that, if implemented, will permanently transform incredible sections of the Skagit Delta into an impervious industrial zone. Before any ranking or site selection is made on these greenfield sites, we request that WSDOT engage directly in a government-to-government consultation with these affected tribes. Floodplain development is regulated by various agencies, including FEMA. Development in floodplain damages the habitat needs for Endangered Species Act listed salmon, including the Skagit River Chinook salmon. And it's difficult to see at 86 and 96% floodplain site coverage how satisfactory compensation could mitigate even the significant impacts. It's unlikely that and not likely to adversely affect ESA listing and steelhead could be achieved. We simply believe that it's not possible when considering the scope and scale of anticipated impacts, direct and indirect and cumulative, to achieve not likely to adversely affect the character and function of the Skagit and Samish basins. We strongly advocate that the Cacc remove Skagit County Southwest and Skagit County Northwest sites from the list of potential new greenfield airport sites in Western Washington. Before any further consideration of either Skagit County site moves forward, the Cacc must engage with both the Swinomish Tribe and Soxhawtl Tribe about specific concerns with these proposals. I appreciate the time to address this group and look forward to further discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Looking at the chat box, looks like Timothy O'Brien, you may go next.
Okay, I will try to unmute myself here.
We can hear you.
Okay, very good. I'd just like to make a brief comment. I represent the Enumclaw Plateau Community Association, and we'd like to speak about, we also are very concerned about the environmental aspects. In particular, this airport would be in very close proximity, the site that's in South King County, which is not supposed to be considered because of the law, the Senate bill that created the commission here. But the rivers would be directly adjacent to this airport, and those are some of our most productive salmon-bearing producing waterways in our region. And so that would, the environmental impacts would be great and quite quick. And the other thing we want to mention is the geography that includes the two gorges that would make it very difficult to build and very expensive to build transportation to an airport in that location. There would have to be many bridges built, and some of these bridges would probably be $1 billion a piece, a mile long, to span these gorges. And I don't think, even though it's very close by proximity in terms of a crow fly, as some would say, to major population, to travel there by car would be, or even train would be very difficult and lengthy. We would ask to consider alternative locations that would better serve the future needs of the growing population that is particularly to the south and to the north of the Seattle-Tacoma area, and offset some of the capacity constraints that particularly they have with the Portland area. The Portland airport only has 2 runways, and also Vancouver, BC is in the same situation. So it seems to make more sense to really consider more realistic views of where and how much capacity is needed. The other thing we'd consider is that the unconstrained demand considered does not seem realistic, considering many people are now being turned away or turned off by in air travel in general. So we'd like that to be reconsidered in a more realistic way.
Thank you for your comment. I don't see any other comments in the chat box. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment? Put their name in the chat box now. I'll wait a second. I see someone is using the hand raising tool, but I don't see their name in the chat box.
It appears to be Ursula Euler.
Okay. She can make a public comment now.
Thank you. I want to second some of what the previous commenters have commented on. My comment directly is that me speaking from Thurston County, the outreach to local jurisdictions and local community groups has been non-existent. If you want to measure it by what they know, you may do outreach in a lot of ways, but it doesn't arrive and it doesn't receive the information that needs to be distributed to those parties. I myself have been framing it in the terms of it has been a very undemocratic process. It has been heavily dominated by for-profit commercial interests. We can see that just looking at the membership of the voting members of the Cacc itself. It is unbalanced and it needs a democratic approach, a much more democratic approach, which with a balanced approach that brings in environmental impacts, that brings in public health considerations at the decision table, not just here like today, just giving 2 minutes of comment. It's insufficient. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. We have time for one more due to time. Amy?
Thank you. Amy Kruver. I am the representative for the 3rd Council District of Pierce County. And I, too, am raising very high cautions on this proposal of these greenfields. 2 of them happen to be in my council district and in a location that has no access for the projected population to be coming out there. The environmental impact, it is very wet out there, and my constituents who have become aware of this, no one wants this in the district. And so I'm speaking for them at this time. It's something I was not made aware of until fairly recently. And I understand it is a project for the next 20 years, but 3rd Council District is not a place for an airport. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you all for participating. This concludes the public comment period, and now I will turn it over to David.
Are you kidding me? This is just fucked. I can't believe this.
David, you're muted.
It seems you're still muted, David.
Thanks. All kinds of problems with microphones, huh? So
There we go.
as we work our way through the presentation today, there's a couple few considerations I'd like to talk about. The first is the update from the Kimley Horn team on the aviation system plan is a technical update in nature, and it really provides us objective considerations, but it doesn't cover everything, as some of our guests spoke about earlier, that goes into siting a new airport. Their work on the system plan is also independent of the Cacc's work. They just happen to be the work of the aviation system plan just so happens to be taking place at the same time, and we are taking advantage of the consultant team's expertise to help inform the commission. It's also important for everyone to understand that additional analysis is going to be necessary on any site recommended. It does not mean a new airport will be located on one of those sites, as they all have their unique challenges that have to be thought about and addressed. Much more analysis is going to go into things like airspace, the infrastructure required, accommodations for air cargo operations, community and environmental impacts, and finally, the cost estimates. On top of all this, the commission is going to need to overlay the technical analysis with the guiding principles as part of the final recommendations. Finally, we have to look at a variety of existing airports and greenfield sites. Part of the process in making recommendations for increasing aviation capacity is to consider the array of options. And given our legislative directions, I think we have done a pretty decent job of doing so. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay and Christina to talk about the public engagement efforts that have taken place to date. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to run through a lot of information pretty quickly here, but you received a lot more detail about all of this in the report that we sent out earlier this week. And if you have questions, definitely let me know. So last month and into this month, we hosted an online open house, very similar to the format and process from the open house we talked to you all about last year. This time around, we added 2 virtual public meetings as another option for folks to engage. We had really great participation. We had around 20,000 users from 23 different Washington counties, and 304 people attended the virtual public meetings. We are so appreciative of everyone who took the time to engage in the process. The online open house was dense with a lot of information, and we got really great feedback from folks. And so the last time I briefed you all on community engagement, we were comparing and contrasting results from the statistically representative survey to the feedback from the online open house. So today we don't have a new survey to compare to, but I do want to call out that people who participate in an online open house or public meeting tend to have a stronger opinion about the topic than the general public. So as we go through the following slides, I'll try to contextualize that, what we've been hearing, with what frequency and from whom, to help give some perspective to all the different input that we have received. One of the big themes I'll note up front, and that you'll hear from me again, is that things definitely feel more personal this time around. Last time we had a big push for input. We're asking more theoretical questions about if and how we should expand. And this time there's a circle on a map. So we heard a lot of concerns from users about my family farm or my church or my kids' school. And at the same time, we saw a lot more recognition about the need to expand and input on the best way to do so. So we can go to the next slide. On the next couple slides, we'll take a high-level look at what we heard from people who shared input. So for each greenfield and existing airport site, we asked, should the state consider this as a location to site a new airport? So you'll see here, yes responses are in green, yes, but only if environmental impacts, including noise and emissions, can be mitigated, are in yellow, and no responses are in red. You'll also notice, if you're trying to do math here while I talk, that while I said we had around 20,000 users, not all of those users answered all the questions or any questions. So the number of folks who actually answered a question is much lower than the number of actual users, which is pretty typical for this type of open house. So based on the open-ended responses we received, most participants fell into two categories. So one category is people who had a personal connection to one or more of the sites being studied, and often was opposed to that site because of the impact it would have on them. The second category, kind of big category of responses we got, was folks, you can go back, I'll quickly go through the rest of these, but is folks who were looking kind of from a more high level and noting things in their responses like population served, available land, economic opportunities, and existing infrastructure. So I'll talk a little more about that as we go. You can see from these numbers that where people were concerned with personal impacts and people were applying that more kind of general criteria was in the far north and south end sites. We see kind of a concentration of responses on the no's or the yeses versus the sites more in the middle, particularly those sites that serve a high number of folks. Those were more split with maybe a high level of no's and also a high level of yeses. So again, I'm not going to read through all the numbers here, but note that this is all in the report that you received earlier this week. So we could go to the next slide. For input on existing airports, we asked the same question, and we saw very high levels of support for increasing capacity at Painfield, with the most common reason given that it already exists and is providing commercial capacity, so it seems like the most logical and simplest option. We also asked if Painfield were to provide additional passenger and or air cargo service, are there things the airport should consider when planning for expansion? And a lot of folks noted environmental mitigation and also made suggestions for specific improvements, such as terminal improvements and more parking options. So go to the next slide. So there was also an opportunity at the end of the online open house for folks to leave a general comment. Many of those were a continuation of comments people provided on greenfield locations. And then the next most common was a preference to use existing facilities as much as possible. That was really a dominant theme in the comments we received, and many commenters noted that they recognize whatever airport exists in a given area may need to essentially be torn down and rebuilt, but at least that site is already disturbed and already generating noise from aircraft. That was followed by concern about environmental impacts and opposition to expanding aviation capacity in general, and then folks sharing a preference for a location not presented as an option. Far and away, the most common location people wrote in was Olympia Airport, and many participants noted that it would be beneficial to have an airport near the state capitol and that it would serve a large number of people. So, next slide. So I will also briefly cover the feedback we got at the virtual public meetings, but I just want to caveat these slides by noting that if we're comparing participation in the virtual public meetings to the online open house, right, we had way more people in the online open house than the virtual public meeting, and relatively few people took the survey after the virtual public meeting. So I mentioned, I think it was 304 attendees. 63 people took the post-meeting survey, compared to more than 12,000 comments we got through the online open house and 60,000 multiple choice question responses. So most people who attended the virtual public meetings did so because of concern about the King County Southeast site in particular. There were also a lot of questions and confusion about airport sponsors and the whole CACC process. We've got a lot of really good information out there as resources, but it's a lot to take in, and a lot of this work is really technical. So it's important for us to keep in mind as the commission continues moving forward, that we continue to strive to make opportunities for public input as clear and accessible as possible. So next slide. As I mentioned previously, most people who attended the virtual public meetings did so because they were concerned about the King County Southeast site. You can see that reflected here. Similar to the online open house, most people who took the post-meeting survey also expressed support for expanding service at Painfield. So again, there are hundreds of pages of detail in the report you received earlier this week. We also will get that posted on the website shortly, and every open-ended comment we received is included there if you would like to read through those. So I know our time is short today. Christina, I don't know if we have time for a couple minutes or if you want to keep moving. I'm sorry, time for a couple questions.
I think we have time for one or two.
So are there any questions? Steve, go ahead, please.
Let me turn things on here. Actually, just kind of a comment, because serving on the commission as a citizen representative, I tried to read as many comments as I could, and when I realized we had 12,000, I knew I wouldn't get through them all. But I did want to share that while I understand that, yes, it has become more personal, I really think we should be paying attention to that because I think it is reflective of a broad base in the community. I saw my adjectives. I saw passion and frustration and even anger. I saw fear of quality of life concerns, and I think, you know, the responding public isn't focused on things that we are often focused on, at least in a balancing act. They're not focused on economics and aviation industry jobs. They're focused on their families. They're focused on health, their environment, their way of life. And I perceived a tremendous thoughtfulness in so many of the comments that I was able to read. And I just want to share that I think the public has done here, and I think the work that we did to solicit this commentary was great. But the public has done an excellent job of informing the commission of the work that we'll need to do to demonstrate that our decisions going forward as we narrow sites actually comply with our guiding principles, all of them, and that our decisions reflect the best alternatives from a public health and environmental health standpoint against alternatives that remain available. That's a big rock to push up a hill, but I think the public's telling us to do it. And I just wanted to share that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that you got through so many comments. It was not light reading.
Jeffrey, go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah, so David, I have a question. I think I was talking to you about this before, and it's regarding the King County side. And given the language in the bill that says that the site should not be in a county of 2 million or more, which essentially means it should not be in King County. Should that site ever be put before the CACC for consideration? And just understand the process. I mean, should we even be voting on that side?
Well, I think you'll see later in the recommendation that there is not a recommendation to move King County Southeast site forward because of what was in the legislation. But it was brought to the table because, one, we need to look at all the array of options, and it was brought through the aviation system plan by the consultant team. That's why it was considered.
So because, and like Steve, I tried to read some of the comments, but it just seems like maybe the committee was, it seemed like people are accusing us of considering that site when we in fact should not have been considering that site.
Yeah, I understand that as well. And I've read all those comments. And I think that the recommendation moving forward honors what people have told us about that it was not permitted within the legislation.
Thanks. Okay, we're a little bit behind schedule, so Lindsay, why don't we keep moving?
That was it. I'm finished.
All right. Well, this is David Williams. I'll get started on the next portion of the agenda items and talk about some of the technical work that our team's been working on, supporting the system plan work. And so went through this last time, but I wanted to share again our team, myself, Pam Kydell-Adams, Laura Holtis, Jeff Stanley, and Joe Hoy are part of our team working through the technical work. Today, myself and Laura will present the information we've been generating, but all of us have been supporting it and be available as questions may come up. So we're going to spend a little time talking through the Greenfields, recap of the Greenfield site analysis, and really just a real quick recap of what we did through the June Cacc meeting. And then we did want to spend a little bit of time talking about what are the ramifications or considerations regarding what a no action option would be. And note that where we are in the study at this point in time, we are not at the NEPA process by any stretch of imagination. But when you do, if a site is selected in some point in the future, FAA does require analysis of a no action option as far as the official environmental review process that needs to happen. So I'll start out just kind of recapping some of the things we did as far as the Greenfield site analysis work, and that was presented at our June 2022 Cacc meeting. I believe all that information should be on the WashDOT's website as well, so you can pull it down if you haven't seen it yet. In that meeting, we presented market analysis and market assessment, process for identifying greenfield sites, and our initial evaluations of those sites. And so on this slide right now, we have the greenfield sites that everybody's been looking at. It was available through that public comment period that Lindsay was talking about, and the map on the side shows information about existing airports and locations of those potential greenfield sites. Just overall recap, we were looking for sites in the general geographic limits of around 100 miles from Seattle to be broad. We wanted to stay west of the Cascade Mountains. We took into consideration other planning studies that have been completed, which there have been over 30 years. Wanted to be sure we were at least evaluating options in multiple counties through the region, and then made some selections based on information gathered during that process. So 10 sites were picked, 6 counties. And as been said, we wanted to be broad in our system planning work, technical work, but as we put here in our notes with our asterisks, King County Southeast is not an option for the Cacc meeting. And so we understand that as well. So again, this is what we did with our initial criteria for evaluating each of those greenfield sites. That is kind of our first step of effort. So we had 5 broad categories of criterion categories. So we looked at the operational capabilities and capacity potential is one broad category. Ground access is another one. Developmental costs. We looked at environmental factors. And we looked at market factors. And then under each of those categories, we have evaluation elements. Those are the items that are in the far right. And so we were looking at a variety of things that are of consideration when looking at a site, from ability to operate a facility, how much it costs in property acquisition, what are those environmental impacts and factors that would be from that site, as well as market factors. The items that are listed there in bold on the evaluation elements, we have essentially eight categories that are listed in that are bolded. Those are the ones that we deemed the essential factors of the elements that we evaluated, and those are the ones that were presented at the last Cacc meeting, shown in our summary information. As I mentioned, we did do an evaluation of all the elements, but we highlighted those ones during that factors. From a variety of reasons, including the ability to actually build and construct an airport, through what are those environmental impacts and factors that each of those sites has, and as well as ability to meet demand. So that was our goal, was to do a high level review of all those sites and understand better which ones are heading down the direction of potentially working. So our next steps and we'll get to kind of our focus on shortlisting from that 10 to a smaller list, and we'll cover that here shortly. But once we have, we know there's a lot more work that needs to be accomplished to really evaluate those sites and what those considerations should be. So Dave Fleckenstein mentioned a variety at it is outset, but these are some things that we'll be working on, looking at airspace, understand how that each of those sites fit in with the airspace, existing airspace and the constraints, understanding air cargo, a deeper dive and understanding of the environmental factors at each of these locations, transportation analysis, access, infrastructure, and then cost as well. We'd like to understand costs from each of these sites. So that's some of the next things that we'll be accomplishing on these shortlisted sites. And from this, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to continue on. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So before Rob Hodgman gets into options, we'd like to first articulate considerations of a no action scenario, as no action still has several implications that we certainly want to be aware of as we move forward. Next slide. So just as a reminder, you saw this slide during our last presentation in June. So to revisit the market analysis, as you recall, 67 million annual passengers, or MAP, is what was identified at the time as the planned capacity in the region, indicated by that dashed line. One thing to note is the exact timing of when demand exceeds capacity will vary based on traffic that actually materializes, how the market will respond in a constrained environment, and how quickly additional capacity is built per the plans. That's that arrow in the middle there. And another nuance with airport planning is facility constraints are based on peak periods, not annual MAP levels. So as our facilities become constrained, it's likely airlines will find other ways to squeeze in a few more passengers without necessarily affecting those constrained peaks. So that's another piece that could slightly shift that time frame of when exactly projected demand exceeds capacity. So what roughly remains is that 27 million annual passengers that will need to be accommodated either at existing airports or a greenfield site, or both, by 2050. Next slide. So like David said, we're not advocating for an outcome one way or the other. We just want to be sure that all implications are considered, including those of no action. And we want to provide some evidence of what those implications could be. So some of those general impacts can include economic impacts, implementation of slot control or demand management techniques, increase in ticket prices, overall airfield restrictions, decreased passenger level of service, and increased pressure on existing small commercial service airports. So in the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through some examples of each of those potential implications. So this first one, when it comes to economic impacts, I'm not going to read through all of these, but as you can see, there's a number of examples of estimated impact of airports reaching capacity or otherwise not being able to meet projected demand. The impacts are often in the tens to hundreds of thousands of jobs and several billion in lost opportunity cost. Next slide. Another implication and great indicator of constrained facilities is implementation of slot controls. So to give you a quick briefing on what that is, it's essentially a limit on planned aircraft operations to manage air traffic and prevent repeated delays. The FAA provides schedule authorization of what time slot each flight operates in, and there's 3 levels. So level 1 is essentially there's no constraints. Level 2 is a voluntary schedule review to prevent systemic delays at busy airports. And level 3 is an airport where demand significantly exceeds the airport's capacity during the relevant periods. And without controls, there would be unacceptable systemic delays. I do want to point out that examples of these severely constrained facilities are few and far between, since our FAA planning process typically identifies and plans for additional facilities before constraints are realized. Therefore, we only have 3 level 3 slot controlled airports in the US currently, LaGuardia, JFK, and Washington National. Another thing I want to note is the process relies heavily on historic slots, which carriers have operated for qualifying duration, and those slots are submitted to the FAA for review and approval. So transitioning that background into what you see on this slide, there's a lot of factors that go into airfares, so it's difficult to pinpoint evidence where fare impacts are directly correlated to slot control, but there has been some research around this. Additionally, and maybe more importantly, is the impact on competition, as well as destination breadth, meaning constraints are likely to lead to reduced service, particularly in smaller markets. Next slide. The other impact is level of service. So to help contextualize what that is, you can imagine passenger density is illustrated in the lower right. We typically strive for optimum levels of service and facility planning, so we're not under providing or over designing when it comes to terminal passenger processing areas. Other level of service metrics you can imagine relate to airfield or airspace delays, such as sitting on the ramp waiting to pull into a gate or circling in the air awaiting a slot to land. Next slide. So last but not least, as our region becomes more congested, there will be an increased pressure on existing small commercial service airports to expand if a well-sited and well-suited greenfield solution is not available. So the purpose of this slide is to illustrate and understand the dynamics of constrained environments. It's not to imply that Seattle will become the next LAX. But in this example, growth pressure on Ontario, for example, is approximately triple the average growth rates for airports in uncongested airport areas, where our typical growth rates are between 1.5% to 2.5%. In Ontario, because of LAX's constraints, they're experiencing about 6% growth. Next slide. So with that context, I'd like to hand the presentation back over to Rob Hodgman to talk about how the potential solutions overlay with our demand projections.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning. Before we do that, I see we have two commission members with their hands up, both Steve Edmonston and Jeffrey Brown. I don't know if those are legacy hands or if there's a new comment. Looks like Steve's taking us down. Jeffrey, are you still wanting to provide a comment?
Yeah, there's a provide comment on the slots.
Please.
Laura, so Laura, I think it's important to point out that slots are not owned by the airport. They're actually owned by the airlines. You know, how the airports try to influence the usage and location of slots, but it's actually owned by the airlines, and it's in some cases considered an asset for the airlines.
Correct. Thank you.
And I think Tony Bean was next, and then Bryce after him. Tony, please.
Laura, can you please, for the public, explain slots and what they are? Because it's a fast thing, and us in the industry, we understand what it is, where it's time at a gate and that kind of thing. But can you break that down so the public gets a better understanding of what exactly that means?
Sure. Can we go back to the slot slide? And I may ask Jeff Stanley or Joe Hoy to chime in here as well. But like I mentioned, there's 3 levels of slot definition. Level 1 is essentially there's no constraints on the facilities. Level 2 is a voluntary schedule review by the FAA to help mitigate delays. And level 3 is that full slot control where you actually go through a process to get a schedule approved. So a typical airline flight schedule, you know, you have a daily profile and there's time throughout the day of when that slot can happen and when that aircraft can fly. So that's actually negotiated with and approved by the FAA. And the purpose of that as well is to mitigate the delay impacts that also impact the rest of the national air system. Jeff, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you did a great job of it. I mean, I'll just kind of take it back a step and say that, you know, in sort of its most basic form, regardless of the level 2 or 3, it's essentially a reservation system. So it's kind of like trying to get into a kind of like the hotspot restaurant, right? I mean, so these airports that have limited capacity and a lot of demand, you know, it's kind of like getting to that restaurant on a Friday night. Always sort of best to have a reservation to make sure that things don't get out of control. So that's essentially the you know, the airline and the airports industry equivalent to having you know, a reservation at a restaurant. So again, just to make sure that you know, the upcoming activity is understood and anticipated and planned for.
You know, I think in simplest terms, what it means is that the airport is over capacity, and it's a mechanism, it's a tool to try and address demand that is higher than the capability to support that demand.
Right.
I'll add to that. I think for people interested in reading a deep dive into slots, the FAA website is maybe a good tool to use, a good resource to use for getting deep into what slot is and what it is and what it's not, and the different information that Laura just shared. I could put that link in the chat if it's helpful.
This is a Teams meeting.
Okay, Bryce, I think you were next, and then David Fleckenstein.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry, this is a little slow. Just in terms of the next steps for evaluation, I think it's slide 18 as I'm looking at it on my computer. You're doing additional technical analysis on the shortlisted airport. You have environmental factors. Does this, and I'm not looking for in-depth, but does this include how it would relate to current goals in state law or state requirements under the Growth Management Act, the impact to, or agricultural lands of long-term commercial significance, or other things like that? Are we going to be looking at kind of what the constraints of state law dictate in our land use planning and kind of overlaying that with portions of this?
Yeah, I think I guess I can respond, and Rob, if you want to add to it. But yeah, I think our first effort was really to look at the first cut of items. We hit wetlands and floodplains, and using the mapper to understand impacted communities. But I think the next level is going to dig a little deeper into each of those sites and see where we are with actual land uses. What are those opportunities or non-opportunities? And so we'll be digging deeper into the state's requirements for each of these sites.
And then in addition, sorry, go ahead. I got one follow-up.
I would add for the commission members that were here on board in 2021, we had a couple of presentations from the FAA that spoke specifically to FAA procedures, and the FAA encouraged the commission to remain kind of at the higher planning level, that the more granular analysis is to be done as part of an airport master plan. That being said, the system plan, and I'm going to speak to this in a couple of slides, the system plan that's kind of a parallel effort already has done a lot of work to get a little bit more granular data that we'll be relying on to share with commission members in a future meeting. So, what we're trying to do here, Bryce, and to everyone on the call, is find that balance between a level of fidelity that will inform commission members with, at the same time, not getting in front of the FAA and the FAA's process.
Okay, yeah, no, I understand that. Again, I'm just curious at how some of these are going to interact with the state laws and what the potential impacts are going to inevitably be if we make an uninformed decision on restrictions that we have in land use policy. Obviously, there's always other things that can overcome that. I just want to be very explicit in that thought process. I think the second one, no, I think I'll stop there. I think I got enough out of what I needed for today. Thank you.
David.
So Laura, can you help us understand the impacts on smaller airports that feed into our bigger system, especially the hub at Sea-Tac? So as capacity constraints occur, what's the likely impact on those smaller airports like Yakima and others?
So it's likely that, as it's noted in that last bullet there, that destination breadth or offerings by airlines would be trimmed out potentially as we exceed capacity of places like Sea-Tac. In addition to that, there's definitely going to be pressure that the airlines are going to want to accommodate that demand somehow. So there would be pressure through other airport master planning processes to kind of revisit those demand projections and figure out how to potentially accommodate that demand. So the demand doesn't just go away because we're not accommodating it. They will try to squeeze it in. And also, again, Sea-Tac would experience likely significant delays over time as we pass that capacity line if there aren't alternatives.
I would add to that. So in Sea-Tac, there's several reps from Sea-Tac on the call, as well as some airlines. So I don't want to speak on behalf of them. But what I would say is that flow control has been in place for a number of years, from Yakima, Wenatchee, Walla Walla, and so forth, into Sea-Tac, which is in many cases their only connection. And so if you live in those communities and you want to go anywhere in the nation or anywhere in the world, that's really the only option as far as getting on a flight locally. So with that said, just to make sure that everybody's clear, the smaller airports across the state would probably be eliminated from access to Sea-Tac at some point as the capacity is focused on the higher volume of passengers.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Rob.
All right. I think we're on to my slide now. I'm the planner, so I get to talk about all the nuts and bolts types of stuff. Thank you, Laura and Jeff and David Williams for your comments so far. So this is the slide that you've seen before a couple of times. Let me just orient you to a couple of things. I've heard the comments, and we understand and we respect that there are varying perspectives on what the future forecast will be for the region. And truth be told, no one really knows what the future holds. However, given a lack of crystal ball, if you will, we have to rely on some kind of a mechanism. And so there are very well-established procedures for trying to anticipate what future demand is. This demand line actually started before this system plan in Cacc. We had something very similar that came out of the Puget Sound Regional Council Regional Aviation Baseline Study. And so, as I mentioned, we do refer back to those studies as directed by the legislation. I'd like to call your attention to the bar chart on the left. So from the 2010 to the 2019 time period, you can see evidence of a very predictable increase in demand. And it follows conventional wisdom that kind of demand is likely to continue. Granted, there are people who are leaving the Seattle metropolitan area. Granted, there are people who are choosing not to fly for a variety of different reasons. So we recognize that the forecast is just that, a forecast. But this is the only reliable tool we have at this point in order to try and address what appears to be very pronounced. If you paid attention to the news lately, there's been a pretty good return at Sea-Tac of volumes. I'm not quite sure that we're at the 2019 levels, but we're getting pretty close. And the Sea-Tac airport has been in the news a few times very recently with some of the activities, the high volume of passengers that have been trying to work through Sea-Tac. And that's in 2022. So as we look forward in 2040 and 2050, it's reasonable to expect that we could see increased need for passenger service for the sole reason they're increase in population density. And there's been questions about population density and whether that's people coming to Seattle. Our consultant did analysis and said predominantly the increase in population in the greater Seattle area is organic. In other words, those people who live in the area that then have children and the children stay in the area. We recognize people have very, very different perspectives on that, but regardless, it seems to be pretty strong evidence that the area population is increasing. So therefore, both passenger service and air cargo needs are likely to increase. So with that said, let me talk a little bit more about this chart. The hashed line that goes horizontally through the middle of the chart, you can see the kind of the stair step above, and then the three green and red colored lines below. So these are really represent two possible strategies. Let me speak to the stair stepping first. So you can see there's the 6 map, 10 map, 15 map, and what those stair steps represent is incremental increases in capacities. So if you were to look, for example, at the 6 map, where it vertically ties into about the 2030 timeframe, what that is reflecting is that in order for the region to be able to incrementally meet the anticipated need for air travelers, that additional capacity to accommodate 6 additional million annual passengers would need to be in place by 2030. And then looking at the timeline, that would give the region approximately 5 years before there would need to be another increase in capacity up to 10 map and so forth, all the way until you get to the 27 map level. But what this strategy implies is that there are existing airports in the region that have the potential to accommodate that increased capacity. And what we know so far from the analysis that we've done is there are a few, but not as many as we had hoped, which is why the Greenfield site is something that has become of a lot of interest to the commission. So the strategy above the stair step is something we would like to do, but we're not sure that we have the tools to do that. Now switching to the strategy below, so you've got scenario 1, which we've talked about in great detail, the no action scenario. And you can see there by that green line, we have a few years before we get to the point that the region is starting to have to experience some of those adverse impacts from being overcapacity. And that then is represented from the red line, roughly 2032, 2033, all the way to 2050. Scenario number 2 then is a single runway greenfield site. So that's in addition to the Sea-Tac Airport Master Plan being fully executed and the Payne Field Master Plan being fully executed, that scenario 2 with one runway would give the region till about 2044, roughly, it looks like. That would get us to the 27 million annual passengers. What's important to note is the very next year we would be at full capacity again, and we would be over capacity. So while a single runway solution would meet the need over the next midterm, ultimately we would be right in the same place that we are right now. And then scenario 3 is a 2-runway greenfield site in addition to the Sea-Tac and Payne Field master plans being fully executed. And that would take us out to 2050. But beyond that, we could potentially still be in the same situation. It's hard to say when you look that far into the future as far as technologies and consumer preference shifts and all the rest of that. But really what's reflected here on this slide is 2 possible strategies for meeting the anticipated need or not. David.
So Rob, I think Carrie Wooler has a question. Carrie?
Thank you for taking my question. This is a question about kind of how demand management fits into the planning process here. Typically, really with any other realm in transportation, we start by looking at operational efficiency and demand management before we get into capacity expansion. And it appears to me that in this situation, we've got demand management as part of the no action option, and it's really characterized as sort of an adverse impact. And I wonder how, I know we've talked about opportunities for operational efficiency. How does demand management factor in as a technique to deal with the increased demand where we don't have capacity to serve it?
That's a great question, and I'm going to ask Jeffrey Brown or Eric or Claire, perhaps. I think that is well underway at Sea-Tac. I think that the Sustainable Airport Master Plan is already addressing efficiencies. I would also say that the 2018 Joint Transportation Committee Air Cargo Movement Study also provided recommendations for how to increase operational efficiencies without adding capacity. So yes, I acknowledge, Carrie, what you say that this appears to omit the operational efficiencies from any of these strategies, but they're already baked in. They're already included.
I think that's great, and I think it's important to point that out. But I think there's advantages to also recognizing demand management as a strategy for dealing with the increases our forecasting expects to see. Not just an impact of not taking other actions, but it really is a strategy that can be deployed, just like we do in other realms of transportation. Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah, let me address that a little bit too, Rob. So you're right, Carrie, that is part of the solution, demand management, but there's obviously trade-offs when you institute demand management. And that's pretty much what the team was talking about. There's trade-offs essentially. So that's one thing that has to be taken into consideration. Rob, back to you.
Yes, thank you. So with that, let me shift a little bit. We're now going to get into narrowing the site. So next slide, please. So this is a slide you've all seen before. This is a direct pull from the previous meeting. This is the 2-runway option developed by the system plan consultant. The only difference is you see there in the bottom row that we've overlaid the projected passenger capacity for each site. So from left to right, you sketch it all the way over to Lewis County. You can see those numbers. And recalling that the charter from the legislation was to provide a recommendation to meet the need, and recognizing the analysis that the system plan consultant has done to identify roughly 27 million annual passengers is the need. Therefore, then it makes sense that we would want to focus on those sites that have the greatest potential to meet that need. So with that, build a slide, please. So obviously, and anybody can see this, there are kind of core airports that have the highest potential you can see by the million annual passengers. But there are some constraints here that need to be addressed. Build, please. we have the red X there over Sea-Tac. I'm sorry, not Sea-Tac, King County. King County's out. So that is clearly demonstrated by the legislation. There's been a lot of concerns and a lot of conversation about that. King County is off the table for consideration. I do want to note that even though we have the 5 airports that are higher performing airports, Thurston County is likely to still be an airport for consideration. Let me talk about why that is.
Rob, I think you mean greenfield sites for consideration, not
I'm
airports.
sorry. I'm sorry. Yes, thanks. I'm talking greenfield sites. Thanks for the correction. So the Thurston County site fits for additional consideration for a couple of reasons. First of all, reaching back to the 1992 flight plan study, there was an enormous amount of work done in that study. 30 years ago, they identified that South Puget Sound was an area that really probably needed a serious look for passenger and air cargo capability. There was a Black Lake site that was identified in that study that has been ruled out. It doesn't fit. The challenge is that at 7.9 million annual passengers, it's not really necessarily getting us to where we need to be as a region. However, if you look at a region-wide perspective, 7.9 million passengers could be part of a solution, recognizing that other sites would have to participate as well. So we don't yet know all the details of these sites. We need to continue to do the detailed technical analysis, as David Williams has already talked about. But for now, the Thurston County site is still being considered. Next slide, please. So now let me talk about the sites we've eliminated. This will jump out at you. The X's mean that site is not being considered, and I'll talk about why. And the sites in the boxes are the ones that are still being analyzed for their potential. Starting from the left, Cacc County, it's just too far north. When you look at the region and the amount of demand, the region is Seattle, it's north of Seattle, it's south of Seattle. But this site is so far north of Seattle, you can see by the million annual passengers there, it's just not really going to provide enough capacity to solve the problem that the legislature directed the commission to try and solve. Moving then over to the 2 sites in Snohomish County, obviously these sites have the potential for greater capacity. However, in that same region is Payne Field, and Payne Field has a 9,000-foot runway, and so I think we all recognize that there's some level of additional capacity that can be provided by Payne Field. So with that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and build a new greenfield site in a region where there already is potential for additional capacity in that same region. And then remembering that of the 27 million passengers, that's spread across north of Seattle, Seattle, and south of Seattle. And so each region potentially should have a part of that as part of the solution. Okay, moving then to King County, as we've already discussed, King County is now out of consideration. I'll come back to Pierce County sites and the Thurston County site. Central, let's go to the Thurston County South situation as Skagit. It's just too far away from the population density to provide meaningful capacity for the region for the foreseeable future. So now let me focus on the 3 sites in the box, the Pierce County site and the Thurston County site. Obviously, the Pierce County sites have the potential to provide a lot of capacity. There continues to be, I think, is pretty commonly accepted that growth is expanding south direction along the I-5 corridor. We're seeing that, and so it makes sense that if you're going to have a solution that's going to meet part of the region's needs, that these sites to the south potentially have the ability to meet those needs. Like I said, there's a lot of analysis that still needs to be done. And we recognize that the Thurston County site may have some limitations. We need to have enough options as we do the analysis for the airspace and the air cargo and the road connections and all of the rest of those things that you've already been briefed on, that we still have something that the commission can move forward with. So with that, I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about legislation. Next slide.
Hey, Rob, can you answer? There's a couple of questions by commission members. So I think the first one was by Bryce.
Yes, I'm not reading the chat. Sorry.
Sorry, it's Bryce. I'm just curious on the location. I haven't done an overlay. Are those two Pierce County ones within the urban growth boundary or outside of the urban growth boundary?
I can't speak to that. I'd have to ask someone from our consultant team. We may not have that information available right now, but we can certainly get back with you if we don't have it available right now.
All right. Well, that's a pretty important thing in terms of how these could actually be cited, because we're going to run into a lot of problems otherwise. So I think it's a pretty important piece that we find out.
Councilmember Groover just answered it and said it's outside the urban growth boundary.
Thank you, Councilmember. I appreciate that.
And then Jeffrey had a question.
Gotcha.
Yeah, on the previous slide, the total passenger numbers you're giving at the bottom, is that in-plane passengers or both in-plane and deplane?
That's both. Million annual passengers.
Okay. Could it go back one slide? Let me see. But that doesn't add up to the deficiency between Sea-Tac and Painfield, right? Because so you still will be short.
Yes, good point. It's a difficult problem to solve. The challenge is that the demand is spread across the region. And so, we use the term communities, or in this case, counties. So these numbers represent the need for residents in each of those counties, Skagit, Snohomish, so forth. So we need a multifaceted approach, a multifaceted solution, recognizing that Sea-Tac is going to continue to follow the master plan. Painfield is going to continue to follow the master plan. We need something else. And depending upon the capacity of a site identified and how close it is to the population density, the more likely that site could evolve to meet the needs of the majority of the region.
I would recommend, in addition to look at the population density, I think you should look at the passenger profile, because I'm pretty sure that most of the passengers coming into Sea-Tac comes from north of Seattle. So if that's the case,
I think the consultant team has that information. I don't have that for you today, but I think we have zip code information.
Yeah, so one of the concerns I would have is that these new sites will be further away from where most of the passengers are coming from.
Yeah, Rob, I'll speak to that. So the demand that we looked at, the future demand that we forecast, we also used historical information that had zip code data attached to essentially the location in the Puget Sound region of where that traffic was originating or destined for. So we were able to see where that traffic was located in the area.
So does that track with my assumption that most passengers come from north of Seattle?
Well, we had that in the map in the last slide. I'm sorry, the last time around. But it's basically it basically reflects roughly the population distribution in the region.
So I've got a slide on that coming up as far as the population pulled from the Census Bureau. So that'll be coming up. So thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Okay, next slide, please. So throughout the almost 3 years that the commission has been at work, we've referred to the legislative guidance many, many times. And so we're going to do that again today to try and make sure that we're still on track. There's a lot of language in the guidance that would be too much to post here today, but here's a couple of sections that I just want to refresh everyone on the call on. The first section, taking into consideration air traffic studies, community representatives, and industry experts. And so I think we're doing that. Certainly with the air traffic studies, we're using the 1992 flight plan, we're using the PSRC Regional Aviation Baseline Study, we're using the 2018 Joint Transportation Committee Air Cargo Movement Study. As far as community representatives, I think Lindsay has talked about that at great length. We've been hearing from the public, and we've been hearing from other organizations throughout the region as well. And then industry experts. Many of you on the commission are industry experts, and we have had conversations with many industry experts. So from that perspective, I think we're still following the direction from the legislation. The other section down here, I really want to highlight the research, and just drop to the end there, to understand the potential environmental, community, and economic impacts. And so that really aligns with the guiding principles. And we've heard some of that already mentioned earlier today. So I'm going to try and connect the legislative guidance with the guiding principles and provide a possible methodology for how we would integrate the guiding principles. So next slide, please. So these are the guiding principles adopted by the commission. This is a direct pull from the commission's charter. Four different principles: public benefit, economic feasibility, environmental responsibility, and social equity. And the question is, how do we actually integrate those into commission discussions? So what follows is 4 slides, one on each guiding principle with a possible methodology. And I want to emphasize possible. This is just a starting point for conversation. We certainly want to hear from commission members, your concurrence, or if you've got a different idea about how we should go about integrating guiding principles. This is just to give you something to think about. We are not going to do the guiding principles analysis today for the simple reason that we don't have all the information. We have some of the information, but as has already been mentioned, there's a lot of analysis that still needs to occur. So with that, next slide, please. So public benefit is defined as benefiting either greater good or the broader public over an individual entity or group. And so how do you address that? Well, the topics that we're talking about are commercial passenger service and air cargo. And so how do you determine whether the greater public is benefiting from passenger service and air cargo, and to what level, versus the people that would be adversely affected by developing a greenfield site that would have negative impacts on their region? The chart on the right is the population density. So this is a direct pull from the Census Bureau. I pulled this down last week, and you can see Washington State's a little under 8 million, and for the greater Puget Sound region, 4.5 million citizens. So it speaks to air cargo. How do you identify how many of those 4.5 million people benefit from air cargo? It really comes in 2 ways. Certainly, there's the small packages that end up on people's doorsteps that are brought in by FedEx, UPS, DHL, and Amazon. Not all of that comes in by air. A lot of that comes in by truck. But there is a sizable amount of air cargo that comes into Sea-Tac every single day that ends up on people's front doorsteps. And then the second part of it is the businesses that benefit from air cargo, whether it's businesses here in the region that are producing products or raw materials that they then ship out, or businesses in the region that are receiving raw materials and products that are part of their business, and the people that they employ, those jobs of those people. So I don't know that we'll ever be able to get to a granular number of how many people in the region benefit from air cargo, but given the individual experience and then the business benefits, 4.5 million people, it's likely to be a large number. As it relates to passenger service, this is statistics pulled from 2019. 2019 was kind of the most recent year of air travel that we have accurate data, because in 2020, obviously, with the pandemic, everything kind of got a little haywire. So this statistic shows that of the 25 million passengers that departed Sea-Tac in 2019, 17.3 million of those passengers originated from the Puget Sound region. So that's a big number. So we're going to continue to do analysis to try and meld these two together. This is one possible approach to addressing public benefit. Next slide. So economic feasibility is defined as the degree to which the economic advantage of something to be made, done, or achieved are greater than the economic costs. So as previously mentioned by David Williams from the consultant team, the system plan will be doing rough order of magnitude cost in order to build a new airport site. We don't have that number today. The chart on the right is from the Puget Sound Regional Council Regional Aviation Baseline Study. You can see the link there. Once these slides are posted, please feel free to click on that link. It'll take you to the report. I want to say it's on page 55, where you can start to read about the 3 different scenarios that were developed by the baseline study. But you can see here in the green box on the far right, for various different levels, scenario 1, 2, and 3, the annual added economic activity from meeting various levels of need. And so when you consider how much a new airport site would cost, whether it's in the millions or the billions, we don't know yet. But as you look at these figures, scenario 2, scenario 3 for sure, which is meeting at least some of the demand, or in scenario 3 meeting all of the demand, $31 billion annual of economic impact and 209,000 jobs. So this methodology proposes to be able to examine the cost, the rough order of magnitude cost to build the airport versus the economic impact that it would provide to the region. Next slide. So the next two slides, one is environmental responsibility, and the other one is social equity. The good news is the system plan has already captured an enormous amount of information on both of these topics. So you can see the box there at the right. These are all topics that were examined and are reflected in the report. And that report, you can see the link there. That's on the Cacc website. Many of you have already pulled that down. But in addition to that, we have the granular data for each location on each one of these areas in order to try and provide commission members with a realistic assessment of each site and where it lands in terms of all of these environmental impacts. And last slide here. So it's the same situation with social equity. You can see the topics that the system plan has already examined. These topics are also addressed in the report. We also have the data for this. So these are proposed methodologies. We don't have to do it this way. If commission members have a different approach that you'd like us to accommodate, you can either make those comments now, verbally, you can drop them in the chat, you can follow up with us later and provide those recommendations. We anticipate integrating the guiding principles once we have enough information to do so, whether that's later this year or maybe perhaps sometime early next calendar year. Once we have that information, we'll include the guiding principles as part of the discussion. So with that, David Fleckenstein, I think we're ready to get on to a break, but I think you wanted to open it up for questions.
Exactly. Thanks, Rob. That was a really great laydown. So for any commission members, before we head into a 10-minute break, do you have any questions about what Rob or the consultant team just laid out for us?
Hi, David.
Steve, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, just Rob, and maybe you on the proposed methodology slide for environmental responsibility, where we've quoted our guiding principles, and then we've looked at the WASP. You've summarized the WASP's work there. And I apologize, it might well be in the full WASP report that cited, and I can take a look. But is there a part of the bullets that are in this highlighted section that you've summarized here, and maybe it's the last one, but where is it that the WASP, and maybe it wasn't the WASP's mission, do we deal with sort of assessing one location versus another location as it pertains to public health, which we always kind of shorthand as noise and pollution? Is that in the incompatible land uses, or is it just not being done by WASP as part of their assessment and we need to do it? But do you have
That's a great question. I think the answer is we need to do it. It's not part of the WASP, not because it's not important, just because it doesn't fit within a typical system plan framework. But I think you're spot on, Steve. We do need to look at that. And so that speaks to the population density in that area and the the traffic patterns. So as I think has been mentioned, we have had a couple of conversations with the FAA. The FAA is helping us with the airspace analysis. I think until we, do a lot more analysis on each one of the possible sites, and until we have a little bit more information from the FAA on potential flight paths, it might be early to do an assessment of what the impacts of emissions and noise would be. But at that point that we have enough information to examine that, I think that that's a good point. So we'll take that note of emissions and noise and see if there's a way that we can add that to this particular methodology.
Yeah, and I just thank you. Great answer, because it's what I was hoping to hear. I had that impression that really is going to come to us, and we aren't going to step on the toes of ultimately a NEPA, down the road. But as choosing between a couple of finalists, we're going to have to weigh in on that issue and see which of those is the best from those perspectives. So thank you, Rob. I think that was a great answer for me to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Orwell?
Thank you. And I don't know if this fits in the guiding principles. I'm just, we're talking about a future airport, right? That's 15, 20 years out. It isn't part of what's guiding us is that we're going to be looking at technologies that would make this a greener and a more environmentally friendly airport that I know in the original legislation talked about community agreements. It just seems like, part of our guiding is that there's different things we can do to mitigate and should that be part of this dialogue?
I'll answer that. Let me answer that, Rob. So, Representative Orwell, that terrific question, because I think that's going to help lead us into the options that we're going to talk about right after the break. And you'll see inside of our recommendation is upfront and foremost that we are going to advocate that we address some of these things as we look at a greenfield site or other things, that we develop the solutions that need to be developed to reduce emissions, et cetera, like sustainable aviation fuel and other things that will really create the foundation for the airport of the future. And you're right, we have 20 years plus if we're looking at a new airport to try and figure all that out. And then I think Mark had a question. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the sequencing of the commission voting on a recommendation and when the guiding principles get applied to that recommendation. I think I understood from what Bob just said is that we're going to vote first and apply the guiding principles later. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, go ahead, Rob.
Let me clarify that. So we don't have enough information to do the guiding principles right now. We are trying to reduce the list of potential sites to those that have the best possible potential to provide additional capacity. So at the point that we have the data and we can actually, if these methodologies are supported by the commission members, at the point that we have enough information to do it, we will do it then. It's just we don't have the information right now.
So then a follow-up, Bob, is so if we determine that something in our recommended approach fails on its alignment with the guiding principles, then we will have a future action on the part of the commission to eliminate a particular site from further consideration. Is that correct?
I don't know that I would say eliminate just yet. I mean, I think mitigate comes before eliminate, and recognizing what we've just heard about the no action alternative, that needs to be part of the discussion as well, because, I think we kind of touched on it a little bit. A no action alternative, if the region continues to need additional air service support, air passenger or air cargo, is that we would have bigger problems at the airports that we have. So Sea-Tac, potentially Payne Field, if we have to overdrive those airports in order to meet community demand for flights and for air cargo, that in of itself is a consideration as well. So even though the options that we've talked about today are the greenfield sites, we have to remember that the no action alternative also has consequences or implications. And so that becomes a trade-off, Mark, of where we can find the best possible solution for the region that is both a responsible approach and meets the needs of the citizens throughout Puget Sound.
Great, thank you.
So Mark, as we will talk after the break about the recommendations, much of what you're talking about is embedded in that. So we're going to take the technical analysis, we're going to take the guiding principles, we're going to meld the two of them together. We're going to bring those sites forward that we think need further analysis. And then that, speaking to what you're saying, that's how we're going to help filter out, which is the best site.
Thank you both.
Yep. Bryce.
Thank you. I've got a couple on two different ones. The first on the economic feasibility. When you all rough out the magnitude of cost for expanding or developing Does this include things such as the cost for expanded highways, extension of services, and stuff like that? Does that include that? I mean, we're talking then just alone in highway expansion to East Peach County, billions of dollars of highways in which trying to find money for.
Yes, I'll answer this and then I'll turn it over to Rob. So the answer to that is yes. With all of the 10 sites that were previously on there, we've already started talking to different regional planners to get their input in regards to what it would take to build road networks, et cetera. So it will be included as a rough order or magnitude of costs.
Okay, and then the second one, I'm gonna go back, I think, to kind of reiterate my point on the environmental responsibility that I maybe, put into the question. You're gonna keep hearing me ask about this because I'm trying to figure out how it fits in. Does the environmental responsibility, while it takes into account a number of different things, such as incompatible land uses, does that include laws that would potentially prohibit the ability for a siting of an airport on a greenfield site in which it does not abide by state law? Because I think that's a factor we need to figure out how we get around or address. The second within this cost is I want to second Steve's point around air pollution, but make sure that we're not only doing the air pollution of the airplanes, which is a very important one. I don't want to dismiss that, but also keeping into account localized air pollution for the increase of vehicle miles traveled to build these. And then the final piece, again, we have a state law that does set goals, and we're hoping to meet those in reduction of vehicle miles traveled on a per capita basis. And are those taken into account if we're talking about the expansion of these areas?
I think some of those yes, some of those no. I mean, this transportation is very expansive. Kerry Wooler on our commission is very connected with those other modes. There are kind of boundaries for what fits in with the system plan and site suitability study. So we'll have to go back and look at in greater detail. I think vehicle emissions may not be part of it. And while we recognize that that's an important topic, it starts to fall outside the realm of what the FAA funded and what the FAA protocol is for a system plan to do. What I would say is that there's a lot of interest and a lot of support for transit. And, we've talked with our colleagues in the Rail Freight and Ports Division about, how we could accommodate rail and eliminate a lot of those vehicle miles traveled. There's a lot of work to be done. It's these transportation plans start to interact and interweave with each other. We've been talking to the regions where these sites, the WashDOT regions where these sites potentially would reside as well. So there's a collective conversation going on, trying to bring together all the various different factors. So I think the intent, Bryce, is to try and weave in as much of that as we can, using the capabilities we have within the Department of Transportation. And we'll have to go back and look at what the parameters are for what system plan and site suitability study accommodate. So I'm going to take an IOU on that, and we can get back to you about the specifics. But if you want to send us an email, that would help for us to
Yeah, I can. Okay. Yeah, I can do that. I guess that just understanding the impacts is beyond just the site specific, and what the actual community are going to be beyond just within X miles of it. I mean, things like 512, 167, and everybody else down there. I just want to make sure that we're kind of widening that scope if we're going to be looking at it. I understand the situation we're in and the limitations, but I do need to stress that there are going to be other impacts, and I want to make sure that we're looking at those as we go through the process.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's also important to think about the future once again. Again, we're talking about an airport. If we build a new airport, it's 20 years plus in the future. So, we're going to be driving different vehicles. I drive a hybrid now. By then I'll be probably driving something that's all electric or maybe hydrogen. So I don't know how you exactly fit that into what you're talking about, Bryce, but I agree with what you're saying. I just think it's kind of it's a little bit hard to say specifically what those impacts are going to be, but I do agree with you. It needs to be factored in.
Okay, yeah, and I think, again, going back to goals within state law of maybe not even GHG emissions dropping, because we know there are going to be technical aspects that are going to get us there, but we do have VMT goals on record that we're asking or trying to ask local jurisdictions to achieve. And if we do something like this, they're going to be negatively impacted. So again, I know that there's a broad sweep, but if we're making sure that we're following and trying to implement goals across a wide range, which includes air traffic travel and other things, I need to stress that we do have multiple goals that we have to figure out how to balance. And if we're not looking at those, we're not going to be able to balance those in an adequate manner. I guess that's what I'm asking for. I know that there's more work to be done. I'm just raising where we're at.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it may come down to we have an agreement on what it is we think should be moved forward, but some of it we may not be able to solve at our level, and we may have to say, hey, legislators, here are the things that are impacts that need to be considered now that this is coming to you, so that we give them an informed recommendation as well.
That's exactly what I was going to say. At the end of this process, the commission is tasked with providing the legislature with recommendations. And there is a limit to how much this body and the system plan can bring, but that doesn't mean that those recommendations cannot include that any new greenfield site would abide by state goals, state laws, and all these other types of things. And we can get granular on that, Bryce, if we want to call out particular facets of that. There's so much here. There's so much here that there are limits to what we can analyze, and there are other areas where we're just going to need some recommendations. For example, not to get off topic, but sustainable aviation fuels is not just a Washington State solution. It's a national solution. And so the ability of Washington State to affect that on its own, there are some ways that we can do that, but it's a much bigger picture. Aircraft that are landing at Sea-Tac are fueled somewhere else. And if we want to reduce the emissions with SAF, those landing aircraft need to have gotten their SAF at their origin. So there's so many aspects of this. It's so big and so complicated. We'll try to address the things that are kind of in our lane to address.
Yeah, and so I think the final thing, I just want to thank you, because I think one of the things I'm trying to figure out is what limitations we have and then what we can put in recommendations, and you answered that without me asking it. So I do appreciate that. I probably should have asked that in a different manner. I didn't mean to not ask it. I think I was just trying to process. So I just want to thank you for that.
That's great. And there are no bad questions from commission members. Jeffrey.
Yes, I was going to just add to that. I think I agree with David and Robert, what you're saying. I think where we are now, we have to make some broad assumptions about environmental impacts. I think the information that Bryce is looking for, I don't think you have that granular information yet to make those, any determination about surface transportation, air quality, or natural resources. You need a lot more work to get that type of information. And for a new airport, you would have to do an EIS anyway. And when you conduct an EIS with the FAA, you use AEDT, which is Aviation Environmental Design Tool, to flush out that type of information. So I think we're far from that granular or in the weeds discussion. And I think my assumption is that we just use broad-based information to make some determination. And the consultants could correct me if I'm wrong.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a good point. Any other comments? Can we move to the next slide then, please? Okay, we are only a couple minutes behind schedule. By my clock, it's
David,
10.
I'm sorry for the interruption. I think Mark Gleason had a comment.
Oh, Mark, I'm sorry.
I think a number of people's hands are raised.
So if you're a member of the public and you have a comment, please put it in the chat. This time is for commission members. So do I have another commission member with a question, please? Mark, did you have something?
No, you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay. All right, with that, it's 10:39. We're going to take a 10-minute break and we'll be back at, let's say, 10:50, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you at 10:50. So it's 10:51, and as we get started here, I'm going to ask commission members, the voting members, to acknowledge that they're here, so we make sure we have a quorum as we go into this next phase of the discussion. Christine and Rob, I may need your assistance in unmuting commission members.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to go down the list here and just, if you would, just respond by saying that you're present. Jeffrey Brown. Lauren Carr, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am present.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Steve Edmondson?
Yes, here.
Thanks, Steve. Tom Embleton? Tom Embleton? Come back to Tom. Mark Inglesian?
Present.
Thanks, Mark. Arif Gals?
Present.
Thanks, Arif. Shane Jones?
Present.
Larry Crowder?
Present.
Stroud Kunkel?
Present.
Jim Kuntz?
Present.
Robin Toth? Come back to Robin. Bryce, Jaden? Okay, let me start from the top again. Jeffrey Brown?
I'll see if I can track him down for you, David. Thanks.
Thank you. Tom Embleton, are you back on? Robin Toth, are you back on? Okay, we're going to pause for just a minute while we wait on the rest of these members to rejoin the meeting.
Hey, David, it's Lauren, if I may, while we're paused.
Yes,
Since I absolutely can see the chat, there were some members of the public maybe that were not able to see the chat, and one of the guests said that they do have access by logging out and back in, and they were able to access it without Office 365 via the web if they there's a button on the bottom that they can enable chat. And I just wanted to make sure that if the members of the public that could not see the chat box heard that and they want to try that, that would at least allow them access.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
Would you mind repeating for members of the public how to initiate the chat? It is not showing up on my device.
So all I was doing is I'm repeating a comment in the chat section from another member of the public that indicated they logged out of the web, re-logged in, and found a button near the bottom that was able to enable chat.
Okay, well, I've already done that several times, and for some reason, chat is not showing up. And I suspect it's true for several others. Or are you be getting more public input?
Well, I'm simply trying to point that out to try to be
Thank
helpful.
you for that.
So,
Jeffrey, you're back on now? Tom Embleton, are you back on net? Robin Toth, have you rejoined?
I'm here, David. I never left.
Okay, thanks, Robin. So I'm just waiting on Jeffrey Brown and Tom to rejoin.
Did Bryce indicate he was back?
Bryce, are you back on? Yes, I see him there. Thank you, Bryce. Sorry about the delay, but we need to make sure we've got a quorum as we move forward here. And Christina, if you would please, would you put the CAC website and the link for comments in the chat? And actually come on off the mic and say it as well, so that members of the public that don't have access to the chat right now could put their comments there.
Yes. I have linked the Commercial Aviation Coordinating Commission website link in the chat box. On that website, you'll find the most recent documents, and you'll also find the online open house full report on there as well. And for those listening in, if you can't see the chat box, you can send your comments to the CAC email. It is cacc@wsdot.wa.gov. So that is cac@wasdot.wa.gov.
Thanks, Christina. Okay, so let's try this again. Jeffrey Brown, are you back with us?
David, this is Claire. I'm trying to reach him through various connections. So as soon as he's on or I have him, we'll let you know. Sorry about the delay.
That's okay. Thank you. Tom Embleton, are you back with us yet? Still waiting on either Tom or Jeffrey to join us. As soon as they do, we can get one, if we just need one of them to join us so we can get started. Okay, I see that Tom is joined us. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So what I want to talk about here is with the information we heard earlier this morning and all the work that's been completed to date, the following are what the planning team believes are the options for us to consider. It starts with the take no action option that Kimley Horn spoke about earlier, and it builds upon the previous one. So from the top to the bottom, option one, the take no action. While this is an option, it will really rely on the market to drive capacity, and it's likely to result in suboptimal capacity, just like was spelled out this morning. Option two relies on Painfield executing what is contained in the airport's current master plan and assumes Sea-Tac will execute their sustainable aviation master plan. And as we heard earlier, that would probably leave us with a projected, and I say projected because things might change, unmet demand of around 27 million annual passengers. Option 3 and 4 build upon those master plans by adding a one runway airport from a greenfield site in option 3 and a 2 runway airport in option 4. Option 3 with a 1 runway would require the smallest amount of land acquisition, but it could fall short, like Rob talked about, of meeting the demand in 2050. The idea behind option 4 is what commission members have called for, which is a greenfield site that has enough room to expand to at least a 2 runway configuration as additional capacity is needed over time. Option 5 incorporates all of what is contained in option 4, and it adds assistance to other airports pursuing regional commercial service as things like emerging aircraft technologies such as hybrid electric aircraft become available. And that really gets to more of a system-wide approach across the state, as well as it adds or continues with the greenfield site option with the 2 runway configuration. So with that, before we go to the recommended option, I want to see if there's any questions or comments from commission members. Steve, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I guess I don't think this makes a difference to these options, but if it does, maybe we can comment it. I know we make the assumption, and it's in bold here, that in each of these options, Sea-Tac executes its SAMP. If by chance Sea-Tac was unable to execute the SAMP for any number of reasons, my assumption is it makes no difference as you've laid out these options. It just makes the pain points higher. Is that correct generally? I'm trying to figure out if there's really something I should be paying attention to this inclusion of the SAMP as an assumption for these options.
Yeah, Steve, you're correct. So the recommendation that we are going to get to has options within options. So if something doesn't come to fruition, if Sea-Tac doesn't execute the SAMP, if we don't get more regional commercial service, if for some reason the state cannot figure out a way to pursue a greenfield site, then there is the capability to rely on one portion of the recommended option as opposed to another one. So there is some built-in capacity to the recommendation that we're going to make, but it's finite, obviously.
Okay. Thank you.
Sarah Kaiser.
Thank you, David. Could you remind me on the on option 3, one runway configuration with minimal land acquisition, how many acres is minimal land acquisition? And I put that in context because, as we all know, Sea-Tac has a grand total of 2,500 acres and has 3 runways. So what is our considered minimal land acquisition number?
let me get Dave Williams to hop back on here. I don't recall that number off the top of my head. What I do recall is that it was a little larger because it has built-in kind of buffer areas to get at the noise issues and the particulate matter issues that we talked about. But David, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Dave, for the one runway configuration, we had a land area of about 2,400 acres. And so agreed that included land for the airfield system terminal, but also buffers around the airport as well.
I'm just mentioning that Sea-Tac has 3 runways and 2,500 acres total.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. Unfortunately, that Sea-Tac is constrained from simultaneous IFR operations, which I think everybody knows. And then, of course, air cargo is a big problem there as well. So yes, they are operated at that level of acreage.
Right. Maybe David could also explain then how many acres a 2 runway configuration is expected to need.
Don't have the number that at my tip of my fingers, but I think it's 3,600 acres. I'll double check that to be sure.
Thank you. Thank you much.
3,100 acres.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
But Senator Kaiser, I think what you're doing is raising the issue that we could fit something in regards to a 1 runway configuration, something smaller than what the consultant has provided.
What I'm thinking is we don't have to do it all at once, but we do need to plan ahead.
Great. And that gets to the whole build the capacity as it's needed over time. And given the fact that things could change, you know, who knows what could happen by 2050? You may not need a 2 runway configuration by then. Steve, your hand was still up. Did you have another point? And then we'll go to Jeffrey.
No, I'm sorry, I took it down.
Okay, Jeffrey, then Lauren.
Yeah, I just need to caution some about using Sea-Tac as a standard for acreage. Sea-Tac doesn't meet the FAA standards, and if you're going to build a runway, a new airport, FAA is going to ensure that you meet the standards. There are a lot of non-compliant areas on the airfield, especially around runway to taxiway separation. In addition to the simultaneous approaches and departures that Rob speak to, we're not meeting some standards in some areas. So if you build it within, certainly you could build it within the 2,500 feet, get some waivers if that's possible, but you're constraining your ability to make the airport as efficient as possible. So I think that's important to note.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. And David, David and Rob, do you want to comment on the fact that the runway configurations, we did consult with the FAA as those were being put together?
Yes, we did. Go ahead, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think as we presented at our last Cacc meeting, new advisory circulars out that was released here in 2022. So we developed our 1, 2, and 3 runway kind of templates to be meeting the current FAA requirements, provide allowances for growth, and also provide allowances to be sure we're able to do that simultaneous operations with IFR conditions. So it was built to meet those requirements, and then also ran by FAA staff and for review and approval.
Thanks, David.
We have a few commission members' hands up. I'm not sure if they're still current. So Jason Thibodeau, Warren Hendrickson, Senator Kaiser.
Yeah, Rob, I think Lauren was in front of them. Lauren, you want to go, please?
Yeah. And Tony Bean as well.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you. And I'm not sure if this is the right slide to add this comment on or not, but suffice to say I will. I just wanted to address the idea of the runway configuration and a couple of concerns with that. And that is, and while there's certainly an example or two of 1 runway commercial service airports around the country, that a 1 runway configuration or a site that can only handle 1 runway initiates a single point of failure where you have due to an aircraft incident or a failure of pavement or needing to maintain the pavement, you can take the airport from full capacity to 0 capacity very easily. And so even though while it may not be desirable to build a second runway immediately, at least the capacity to have the second runway, I would say is important in that it will help mitigate risk going down the road, that you don't have an airport out of commission for some period of time due to pavement failure or an incident at the facility. And I'll stop there.
Lauren, especially when you have to reconstruct that runway, which has to happen at some point in the life of the airport.
Absolutely.
Yeah, both good comments. Thank you. Robin.
I was just wondering, and maybe you already said it and I missed it. We're talking about runway configurations on the new airports. And I see that Seattle has its sustainable airport master plan. I'm wondering what we're thinking about the idea of vertiports and things like that. Are those going to be incorporated later on in the plan, or is that something that we're going to think about, sooner than later?
So if you look at option number 5, that has that type of technology embedded into it. We've talked more about distributed air service because that would probably be more impactful based on the fact that the aircraft that are in development today, the 12 to 15 seat electric hybrid or all electric aircraft, could make a dent in moving people, but the vertiports would be lesser numbers, but they would be included in that whole airport of the future concept.
Okay, and we would include that planning to accommodate those types of areas at other airports as well. So I know like it's a trickle down or a trickle up process, whatever you want to call it. So, okay, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that I don't want to put AIRF on the spot, but I think that within their master plan, I think within one of the options that I've seen for Olympia, and I know that Sea-Tac has been thinking about this as well. How do you incorporate vertiports into your current footprint to be able to facilitate those operations? Rob, did you have something?
I just wanted to add, Robin, absolutely. The vertiports are likely intra-city or intra-region. Distributed air service is more inter-city, but regardless, we have to have a hub. And so that's kind of the common denominator in all of them, is there has to be a place where folks, whether they're coming in from a small eVTOL aircraft or whether they're coming in from a small electric airplane, if they're trying to go somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the world, we still need the hub.
Correct. Okay, thank you guys.
Certainly. Jason, then Warren. Jason.
Yeah, quick question, clarification on the options as laid out. And I know there's some, there can be some confusion with the work of the WASP and the work of the Cacc. So there's the no action option that's listed here. Are these the options that are on the table for the Cacc? Because it's my understanding that the mission of the Cacc is to make a recommendation for a location. So is the no action option really on the table for the work of the Cacc?
No, not really. I mean, the commission could say that based on whatever the factors there are, that we don't have a recommendation to put forth. But really, that take no action is a way to describe what would happen if the commission doesn't take an action. But it is overall, we could still say that there's nothing that we have to recommend, but that's unlikely given what we've been through and the analysis that we've completed. Warren?
Thank you, David. Yes, Jason actually teed up exactly the conversation I was going to bring. While I was going to mention it, we'll be getting into process here shortly. But while this slide was up, this seemed like a good time to address it, was on the take no action, is we do have a legislative mandate to make this recommendation of 2 airport sites by October 15th. Ultimately, it could be the purview of future airport sponsorship, the legislature, other bodies, organizations, the political will of the Puget Sound region to take no action, but that's not the decision before the Cacc today. So I appreciate Jason bringing that point up, and I think that directs a little bit some of the decisions we need to make today. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. That's really helpful. Okay, if there aren't any other comments from commission members, we're going to move on to kind of the recommendation that we've put together. So the recommendation from myself, Warren as the vice chair, and the planning group is really that the best option to pursue is 5. And that includes adding capacity to Payne Field according to its airport master plan. It assumes Sea-Tac executes its sustainable aviation master plan. It assists other airports interested in pursuing regional commercial service. And this speaks to distributing regional air service across the state as emerging technologies such as hybrid electric or all electric aircraft become available. And finally, the recommendation incorporates continuing to develop a greenfield site option that could support up to 2 runways. So based on everything we've talked about and heard, this is the one I think is the best option because it suits the needs of adding capacity over time and incorporating sustainable aviation technology that is available today and that which is currently in the works. It also contains a layered option. It also contains what I would call layered options, making it more resilient to change, narrowing change or circumstances that could prevent a portion of it from not being doable. And someone asked about that. I think it was Steve. So in lieu of narrowing the recommendation down to 1 greenfield option at this time, we believe additional analysis needs to be conducted on those sites that Rob talked about, the Pierce County East site, the Pierce County Central site, and the Thurston County Central site. We simply need more information about each one of the locations before we can say this is the most viable option. Finally, the feedback we've received to date. People want us to lead with environmental sustainability before committing to a new airport. We agree, but we think the state can do both simultaneously. A new airport could be up to 20 years or more down the road. So with that in mind, we absolutely should pursue the airports to the future concept that utilizes things like sustainable aviation fuel, electric ground support equipment, EV and public transportation charging, the use of alternate propulsion systems such as electric or hydrogen, and more as it becomes available. I won't speak for Warren or the rest of the planning team, but my personal feeling is that the state should not plan to pursue a new airport that replicates an airport of today. The responsible thing to do is simply to make it an airport of the future. Not only do I believe we can do this, I believe we can also transform our existing airports with the first step of figuring out how to produce and distribute sustainable aviation fuel in meaningful quantities within Washington state. So that is our recommendation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Warren. He's going to help facilitate the rest of this discussion. And then we'll see if we have something that we can vote on. Warren, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. And to the commissioners, the staff and visiting consultants and the public, my name is Warren Hendricks and I am the vice chair of the commission. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you, David, for that. I want to take a few moments to explain the process that we'll now engage in going forward. The first one is with regard to comments, and comments will be restricted to commission members, but both voting and non-voting. Recognize, please, if you want to make a comment, it would be best to do so verbally. Not all commission members, myself included, have access to the chat just due to software limitations. And so as a result, it would be good to raise your hand, be recognized, and I will ask for David and Christina's assistance to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to make their comments. Once we get into a position of voting, the voting will be voting members only. And there are 14 voting members to the commission. So comments for all, the voting gets down to the voting members only. There is a need to discuss quorum versus requirements. So The legislation behind the commission did not establish a meeting quorum for actions and decisions. We did that internally through our charter. That quorum for making a decision today is 12. We have 13 voting members on there, so a quorum is met. The requirement for a decision is 60% of the voting members, and this was included within the founding legislation. There are 15 voting member positions. 60% of that number is 9. For an ultimate decision to be made today, we need 9 affirmative votes on whatever motion is moved, seconded, and then approved by the body. Today, with 13 members present, voting members present, any number greater than 4, either nay votes or abstentions, means the motion fails to pass. And we will need a subsequent motion until we can finally reach a point where there are 9 affirmative votes with a solution that meets that requirement. Again, as we just discussed, a no action is really not one of the alternatives available to us today, because we do have a mandate to provide 2 airport sites to the legislation on October 15th. David will actually lead the motion. I, as a non-voting member, should not do so. So when we get to the point that we're ready to do the motion, I will pass it back to David. He will entertain the motion, second, and subsequent discussion and call for the vote. We are going to try something new. When whoever decides to put forth the motion, if you would do so and speak slowly and clearly, we are actually going to attempt to craft a slide that actually duplicates the motion as presented, and then show that slide before you so you can see in writing as well as listening verbally to what the language within the motion is. And then we will go forward from there. So with that, I will now entertain the opportunity for all commission members, voting and non-voting, to go ahead and make any comments that they have with regard to the recommendations and options before us.
And we've had a request to go back to the previous slide. So there you go. Thank you.
There you go. Okay, so Mark, your hand is up first. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Warren. Can we see a visual, a map visual of the 2 Pierce County and Thurston County sites? Would that be possible?
Yes, I think those are within the slide deck. So, David, can you pull those up?
Yeah, give me a second. I'm gonna stop sharing so I can pull up that slide, and I'll reshare here.
Okay. While we're waiting on that, are there other commission members that have comments or questions?
I see Senator Kaiser.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, David. I don't need to have this today, but I would like a more in-depth discussion of distributed air service supported by emerging technologies. The conversations I've had with air carriers have not been very encouraging, and I am not clear how we pursue that if we don't have industry support. And I do not want us to be sidetracked on something that doesn't really address the fundamentals. And I like the idea of having distributed air service, but if we don't have the industry on board with that as part of the plan, I'm concerned it might distract from developing and coordinating development of a greenfield site.
Yeah, duly noted, Senator Kaiser. And it is not a big, like I said, it is not a big piece of solving the solution. We're talking about small regional commercial service. And much of this is where perhaps we had regional commercial service at one time and we lost it, and an airport would like to bring it back. So all I'm recommending is that we help facilitate that process, whatever that might be, whether it's engaging with them in industry, to see, what can we done, whether it's we go after grants at the federal level to try it out where they provide grants to encourage those types of operations for a period of time. That's really what I'm recommending.
Okay, it looks like David has resumed his slides. So David, if you would show then the relative locations of Pierce County East, Pierce County Central, and Thurston County Central.
Yeah, I'll just put each one on there. I wasn't sure if there was you just wanted to see the map of where they were if you had any conversation about it. But this is just the Pierce County East site, kind of south of Graham is the general vicinity of where we're looking at off Highway 161. Pierce County Central, this is essentially south of JBLM, south of Frederickson, a little bit east of Yelm as far as kind of general location for where the Pierce County Central location is. And then the Thurston County is really due east of where Olympia Regional Airport is situated now. So east of Olympia and kind of near 510, basically.
Good, thank you. Mark, does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, Tony Bean, you're next.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Warren. Just speaking from experience on this, because we just went through this, we finally finished the realignment in Pullman, and it's a hard process. And I can't say enough about the appreciation for the staff and the consultant communities on just trying to get this far. And I know a lot of people want to get to the end of this, but there's a lot that has to get done no matter what the option is. And the one thing I know is it all happens in little tiny pieces. And so you get the little tiny pieces right, and hopefully you end up with the big thing at the end. I think the recommendation is pretty spot on because it's things that are measurable, that can be done. It's going to be a long process, and somebody's got to shoulder that burden. It needs to find a sponsor. It has to go through NEPA process. And a lot of the concerns that people raised as we've gone through this process for the last couple of years, they do get addressed. It's just in different pieces. Right now, it's a recommendation. But looking back on our experience, the more land you can get, the better. Because the FAA can put in different things. One of the things we found is you think you're going to get a straight-in approach. They put an offset approach in. You didn't buy the property for the offset approach, and then you have to go back and try to do that again. It's much harder the second time around. So I guess the forward thinking that this commission has done and that the consultants and WashDOT is appreciated. And I think it's been very, very sound. I know there's been glitches with certain things and trying to get information out to a whole bunch of people. There's a lot of people to touch because nobody's picked anything. A lot of the comments I've seen have been, well, don't do this here or don't do this here, but nothing's been chosen. It's an option, but the fact that the magnitude, when you're trying to look at the options, the wider your vision is, the better off it is. And when I asked the question about slots today is because it doesn't just affect what happens in Western Washington, it affects everybody. If we lose our air service capability to get to Sea-Tac, we lose our entire community to the air system. It's massive to the smaller airports that are in Washington State that are not necessarily in Western Washington, but it affects us in the same manner, where it's a significant accessibility issue, and our economies and our quality of life is wrapped in just like yours is. So I just appreciate everybody's forward thinking on it and the fact that everybody's trying to get as wide of a mindset as possible. And so that was my comment.
Thank you, Tony. Bryce?
Thank you. Appreciate it. And I'll probably say this again once we get a motion, just to make sure that it's included. And it's something I raised a few minutes ago, is making sure that we are addressing the limitations of land use law in Washington on the impact of potential sites, especially greenfield sites under this. And that includes things like loss of agricultural resources and other things. I, again, understand the charge that we're met with today and we're being asked to do. But I think in the comments to the legislature, we do need to address and understand that there are existing conflicts that need to be resolved, and one of those is a long-standing state legislation that dictates a lot of how we do our land use planning and protects our farms, forests, and waterways. So I'll say it again once we get that. I need to reiterate that whatever option we do choose, we need to take into account state regulations and state laws.
Thank you, Bryce. And Stroud. Might be one more button there, Stroud, to unmute.
Can you good now?
There you are. Excellent.
Okay. I think we do anything else, it's just going to limit what we do in the next 30 years. I think we need to leave ourselves enough room to maneuver, whether it's up or down. So I think this is a good option.
Thank you, Stroud. Just want to confirm, David, Christina, you don't see any other hands raised.
I thought I saw Larry Crowder.
Yeah, Larry, did you have something for the group?
Yes, thank you. Just with regard to the motion and the statement made about trying to include land use types of requirements, I'm opposed to trying to hang a number of caveats onto the motion. I think the motion needs to be as clean and straightforward as possible. I think it goes without saying that the process that would be followed to develop any of the recommendations ultimately will follow all applicable laws and regulations. So I think we need to be very careful about trying to hang a bunch of caveats onto whatever motion is made. So I will be opposing those types of amendments if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, I would sort of agree with Larry. Bryce, do you want to clarify? Are you just wanting us to make sure it goes forward as a point?
Yeah, I'm not asking for an amendment to what's written in here. I just think that whatever we submit to the legislature needs to make sure that they understand that there might be conflicts that need to be resolved. One of those is the Growth Management Act. And I need to be very upfront that something like this is different than a lot of the issues that we face, but the massive loss of farmland and agricultural land in Washington over the last 20 years is staggering. And understanding the impacts of that, because I don't want us to go through a whole process and have people forget that we do have limitations and that become a big stumbling block because we didn't think about it before. So no, I'm not asking for an amendment to any of these. I just want whatever report goes to the legislature to say that they need to address and look at, longstanding laws and implications for land use outside of an urban growth boundary, because the impacts of this and the long fight that's probably going to ensue is something they need to take into account. So I'm not asking for an amendment. I just think that whatever we produce, there should be something in there that says there is Growth Management Act implications to studying a potential Growth Management Act. Again, I think that there needs to be a whole host of options and we need to continue looking at them. I'm not saying no to anything. I'm just indicating that we have not addressed arguably one of the biggest limitations that would prevent a greenfield site in the outer areas of Pierce County at this point.
Thank you, Bryce.
Bryce, thanks. And we very well we will see about putting that in as part of the recommendations. We've already made recommendations at this point, so we can roll that into the report because your point is more than valid. It's got to go in as part of the decision-making process with the legislators.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, just for clarity, I'm not asking for any changes on this. I appreciate the concern for potential changes, but again, I think those just need to be noted in the report so we understand what we're talking about at the end of the day.
Understood. Warren, I think you have a point, then we're going to go to Senator Kaiser.
Well, actually, I'm going to come back to mine. Just a clarification here. The words on the slide right here are a recommendation. That is not an emotion. that has been written, offered, or made before the commission. So it is just the recommendation of the chair, vice chair, and planning group. I will come back and address a few comments in a moment, but in the meantime, Stroud Kunkel, you had your hand up first. Yep, we can hear you, Stroud. No.
I think it's an old hand.
There you go. You're there.
Warren, he said that's a legacy hand he's got up. So why don't we move to Representative Dent?
Thank you, David. So I just like to talk, having a big part of this legislation that created the Cacc committee here and what we were looking for. And the recommendation that we come up with, or that you folks, the voting members, come up with, is a beginning of a process. It's not locking anything into stone, but it begins the process. And, we knew when we created the legislation that identifying a greenfield site was going to be a real challenge, and even identified other airports that could, take some of the pressure off of Sea-Tac would be a challenge. And I have to commend this committee for their hard work and what they have done, and as deeply as they've looked into this, considering we've had to deal with a pandemic, and most of us know that to sit in this room right now and being in person would be much preferred as to be virtual. So I think the committee's done a great job, but just remember, this is the beginning of a process. This is not the end. So again, thank you to everyone who's worked so hard on this, and I appreciate every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Dent. Now, if I can, without further hands raised, I'm going to take off my facilitator hat and wear my non-voting commission member hat and explain why I support this particular recommendation. First and foremost, it's a collaborative approach and it's a regional approach. We're all in this together. We need Sea-Tac, we need Painfield, but we cannot meet capacity without a greenfield site. The data and the technical analysis has shown that. The decision before us today is to meet the demand in 2050. However, we must be mindful, what will that demand picture look like after 2050? This is not just a 20-year solution. We need to be thinking as a body 50, 75, 100 years down the road. We have to focus on resilience, the options, and then the locations, and certainly take advantage of future technology. This recommendation includes all those elements. With regard to the greenfield site locations, again, it's a matter of looking at the population density, what the industry is looking for, and ultimately we have a north site commercial service in Painfield. We have our central to the region airport at Sea-Tac, and the industry and the population demographics then dictate that the South Sound be served. These three sites, Pierce County East, Pierce County Central, and Thurston County Central, do that. Each of those 6-mile circles are not written in stone. They can adjust, they can move around. Ultimately, somewhere within that oval is a spot by which a future airport could be sited to meet future demand. And for those reasons, that's where my role is in this recommendation. So those are my comments. And at this point now, it's time to move forward to the actual vote and motion tabulation. So I will now hand it back to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. So as we move forward, again, we're gonna need a motion. I would like to start with a motion on the recommendation, if there is one, before we entertain anything else. So we'll need a first, a second. We'll open it back up for discussion, and then we'll go to a roll call vote. So with that, is there a motion on the recommendation?
David, it's Lauren.
Yes, Lauren.
I move that the commission accept recommendation 5 as written on slide 44 of today's presentation.
Thank you, Lauren. Is there a second?
This is Robin. I will second that.
Thank you, Robin. Open for discussion. Discussion on the motion. Steve, please. Steve, you're muted if you're trying to say something.
Better now?
Yes.
Okay, better now. I'll be voting in favor of the motion. And I just want to make this short statement about that. I think based on the statements I heard during our presentations today, and our commission's expression today to an ongoing commitment to applying our environmental guiding principles to the decision we're making, which I believe include assessments of community public health impacts relating to noise and pollution, this is the right option for us based on everything that we have studied. I'll be voting in favor.
Thank you, Steve. And Stroud, sir, do you still have your hand up? Or do you have a point to make?
No.
Okay, thank you. Tom? Tom, you're still muted if you're trying to speak. And Stroud, I think you're not muted. Thank you. Sorry, Tom, I'm looking for, oh, okay, yeah. Can you go back to the previous slide, please, for Tom? So Tom, do you have a comment you'd like to make? I'm looking at the chat right now, tracking your last comment. Okay, so seeing nothing from Tom, let's go back to the recommendation. Okay, I've got your note there, Tom. Thank you. Any other comments?
David, could you share Tom's comment because not everybody has visibility to the chat?
Yeah, thanks. I'll do that. It says, thank you. Just checking what the difference was between 4 and 5. I support 5. That's from Tom Embleton.
Thank you.
I'll give it just a second for any other comments. If there's a commission member, you can just unmute yourself and make your comment. Rudy, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't know if this is appropriate. As a non-voting member, I can't vote, but I certainly, if I can, I would call for the question.
Okay, thanks, Rudy. And yes, non-voting members are welcome to comment right now. Warren, go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering about that, whether it was appropriate to comment as a non-voting member during the discussion after a motion. I want to come back and revisit Bryce's comments briefly, and I think to be mindful, when we think about this proposal and ultimately how we're going to meet this demand going forward, there are tons of issues surrounding infrastructure. And when we think of infrastructure, we think of roads and sewers and water and highways and rail and transportation. But part of the infrastructure that allows for a successful conclusion going forward is the legal and regulatory environment that allows that to happen. And that is the Growth Management Act. That's going to be state law. That's going to be federal environmental requirements and regulations, the FAA design standards. So when I think of infrastructure for a new airport development, all of that is inclusive, both the written word and the guidance by which we achieve this objective, as well as the physical facilities that we're going to be building. So I'd like to just say to Bryce that we're going to do this, and we're going to create the environment that it takes to be successful at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Bryce, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again. I anticipate I will be voting for option 5 today as well. I did just as we work through the process, I want to make sure that we don't forget and we think that we can inevitably override. I think that there's a lot going on, both from a public health, as Steve mentioned, that we do have when we talk about busy areas and having airports there. Those are major concerns. So I'm not trying to discount anybody's. I just want to make sure that as we go through the process, we are noting that there is a large regulatory issue with some of these, and it's not something that can't be overcome. I just need to reiterate that the land use issue is going to become probably a very large issue that we have to think about, talk about, and address the not just the full infrastructure costs, but also thinking about what does it mean to have growth pressures around areas such as that and other knock-on effects. So again, I appreciate that, and I think my comments will, inevitably show up in some form in the report, which I'm happy with. And again, I don't have much concern with this today. I just have to make sure that the charge I was instilled with when I was appointed is to make sure that we are looking at land use regulations throughout the process.
Thank you, Bryce. Much appreciated. Okay, with that, I'm going to call for the vote. I'm going to read your name off for the voting members. Because we're on a Teams call, my preference is for you to say yes or no. So if you're saying yes, you support the recommendation or the motion. If you say no, you're not supporting it. So I'm going to go, I'll start with Jeffrey Brown. Jeffrey, and Senator Kaiser, you're not muted right now. Thank you.
Yes, in favor.
Thank you. Lauren Carr.
Yes.
Thank you, Lauren. Steve Edmondson.
Yes.
Tom Embleton. And Tom, if you can't unmute yourself, if you could put it in the chat, please. Tom says, I am supporting the recommendation. That's a yes. Mark Inglesian.
Yes.
Thank you, Mark. It's up to me, and my vote is yes. Shane Jones.
I vote yes.
Thank you, Shane. Larry Crowder.
Yes.
Thank you, Larry. Stroud Kunkel.
Yes.
Jim Kuntz.
Yes.
Thank you, Jim. Robin Toth.
Yes.
Thank you, Robin. Bryce Yaden.
Yes.
Eric Gauss.
I'm going to abstain.
Understand Eric is abstaining. And just to make sure that Andrea did not join us, Andrea Goodpasture. Okay, nothing heard from Andrea, so she did not join the call. So with that, the yeses have it. The motion carries with one abstain. Thank you all very much for the discussion and the additional comments, especially those made by Bryce and Steve, and for the members of the public that weighed in with their discussions. We will do a better job of making sure that we communicate with you and trying to fix these issues with the chat. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, and I think it's going to be a couple down from that. So next steps, we need to produce a report to the legislators that details this recommendation, which we'll work on. We'll get that back out to commission members for you to review and comment on before we send a final to the legislative body. We do need to do the additional analysis on the potential sites that we talked about. There's a lot of work yet to be done. So I think the actions we took today were prudent. We didn't narrow it down to one greenfield site because I kind of think that would have been irresponsible at this point, given the comments that were made. So thanks. Community engagement. The community engagement continues. We appreciate all the comments we get from people. We've heard what you said. The commission members get all those comments. And as we look at these 3 greenfield sites, we will narrow down that community engagement to those in those communities as well. And finally, the commission will have to provide the final recommendations by June of 2023. And I think that, at this point, we're on a pretty good path to do so. So I'm going to open it up for last minute comments from commission members. And I see that Jeffrey's got one. So Jeffrey, please.
Yeah, so David, I'd like to make a statement before you adjourn. And just generally to everyone I've worked on the committee with, it's been a pleasure working with you guys. And from a statement, you know where I'm going. It's really rewarding for me and very informative to engage in this public process. But unfortunately, I've decided to leave the Port of Seattle, go join private practice, and also moving out of state. So with that, I bid you guys goodbye. I know you guys will come to a good decision on the preferred site. And in the interim, Claire, on? Claire, can you come on the camera, please? Claire Gallagher from the Port of Seattle will be temporarily taking my position until the port goes through the process of naming a replacement. So with that, guys, goodbye and good luck and all the best.
Jeffrey, thank you, and good luck to you and your family. You've had a big impact on a lot of different things, not just with this commission. So you've been a great help, and all of your comments have been really helpful in this tough work. So thank you, and Claire, thank you for stepping up and helping out the team. So again, good luck to you, Jeffrey,
right,
to you and your family.
Thanks.
Eric.
Hi, guys. Number one, I want to thank Jeffrey. He's been an absolute asset to the region. So thank you for all your great work in the region. We're certainly going to miss you, Jeffrey. And then secondly, I wanted to explain my reason for abstaining on the vote. Plainfield is currently in the process of going through our airport master plan. It hasn't been adopted. We haven't completed our public outreach. We have a lot more of that to do. And then obviously the plan has to be adopted by our elected officials. So since the motion included an assumption that we'll be adopting our airport master plan, growth plans, etc., that's not a certainty in any way at this point because we haven't completed the process. So that's the reason why I decided to abstain. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any comments? Okay, with that, again, I want to thank everyone that contributed to today's work, especially our consultant teams from Kimley Horn, PRR, and our own internal team, mainly the work of Rob Hodgman, who's done great work in trying to figure out this really difficult challenge that lies ahead of us. Again, I think we're on a pretty good path, and I appreciate everyone's input and sticking with the team. So with that, the meeting is adjourned. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.